Sometimes the hardest prison to escape is the one you build around your own heart. Sometimes it takes saving another soul to remember there's still good left in yours. In Montana's frozen mountains, old Jeremiah Holt finds a wolf pup locked in a cage, starving and scared. The trapper has lived alone for years, carrying guilt from a war he couldn't forget and a family he couldn't save. But this wolf reminds him of something he lost long ago: hope. What happens when two broken souls find each other in the wilderness? Can an old man haunted by his past find redemption by saving a creature that mirrors his own pain? As winter closes in and danger approaches, Jeremiah must choose between staying safe in his isolation or risking everything to set them both free. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning came slow and grey over the Bitterroot Mountains, the kind of dawn that promised nothing but the cold comfort of another day survived. Jeremiah Holt stood at his kitchen window, hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that had seen better decades, watching the snow fall in fat, lazy flakes that would soon bury yesterday's tracks. At 67, he'd learned to appreciate the silence that came with winter mornings. No birdsong, no wind through the pines, just the soft whisper of snow against glass and the steady tick of an old clock that had belonged to his father. His cabin sat tucked into a fold of the mountainside like a secret, invisible from the logging road below unless you knew exactly where to look. Jeremiah had chosen this spot 30 years ago for that very reason. The world had a way of finding a man when he didn't want to be found. But up here, surrounded by Douglas fir and lodgepole pine, he could pretend civilization was just a rumor. The coffee in his mug had grown cold while he stood there, lost in the kind of thoughts that came to men who spent too much time alone. He dumped it in the sink and reached for the blue enamel pot on the wood-burning stove. The kitchen was small but efficient, everything a single man needed and nothing more. A scarred wooden table where he took his meals, shelves lined with canned goods, and mason jars filled with dried beans and rice, hooks on the wall for his cast-iron pans. No photographs, no decorations, nothing that might remind him of a life he'd left behind. But reminders had a way of surfacing anyway, like rocks in a spring thaw. The bronze star sat hidden at the bottom of a coffee tin on the highest shelf. Wrapped in an old handkerchief his wife had embroidered with his initials, JTH, Jeremiah Thomas Holt. Staff Sergeant, United States Army, 101st Airborne Division. He hadn't looked at the medal in 15 years, but he knew it was there, tarnished and forgotten, like the man who'd earned it in the jungles of Vietnam. Sometimes, on nights when sleep wouldn't come, and the whiskey had run dry, he could still hear the helicopters and smell the cordite. Could still see the faces of the boys who hadn't made it home. Boys who'd looked up to him with eyes full of trust and faith in his judgment. That trust had been misplaced. He poured himself fresh coffee and settled into the worn leather chair by the fireplace. The same chair where he'd spent countless evenings reading by lamplight or simply staring into the flames. The morning ritual was always the same: coffee, a scan of the weather through the window, then the slow process of planning another day in a life that had shrunk to the size of these four walls and the wilderness beyond. Jeremiah had been a different man once. A husband, a father, someone who believed in duty and honor and the possibility that good men could make a difference in an ugly world. That man had died somewhere between the hospital bed where his wife took her last breath and the courthouse steps where his son had walked away without looking back, choosing a bottle over the broken-down veteran who'd failed them both. Sarah had been patient with his nightmares, understanding about the long silences and the way he'd sometimes startle awake, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. She'd known what the war had done to him, had married him anyway, believing that love could heal whatever damage those jungle months had carved into his soul. For a while, it seemed like she might be right. Their son Michael had been born healthy and eager, a boy who'd looked at his father with the same hero worship Jeremiah had once felt for his own dad. But wars don't end when soldiers come home. They follow them, settling into the quiet spaces of ordinary life like smoke in fabric. Jeremiah had tried to be the man his family deserved, but the ghosts wouldn't let him rest. He drank to forget, then drank to forgive himself for forgetting, then just drank because it was easier than facing another day sober. Sarah had endured it for 18 years before the cancer took her. And Jeremiah sometimes wondered if the disease had been a mercy, freeing her from the burden of loving a man who'd lost himself in a war that ended before his son was born. Michael had been 23 when his mother died, old enough to understand, but young enough to blame. The last words they'd spoken to each other had been sharp with grief and accusation. Son telling father that he was nothing but a drunk who'd killed his mother with neglect. Father responding that at least he'd never run from responsibility the way his boy seemed determined to do. They were both wrong, and both right, and both too proud to bridge the gap that opened between them that day. The boy had moved to California, chasing dreams of music and stardom that never materialized. Jeremiah heard through mutual acquaintances that Michael had found his own relationship with the bottle, that he'd died in a car accident outside Sacramento 5 years ago. Alone and broke, and probably thinking about the father who'd taught him how to run from pain. The funeral had been small. Jeremiah sat in the back of the chapel, wearing the same black suit he'd worn to Sarah's service, listening to a minister who'd never met his son talk about God's plan and eternal rest. He'd wanted to stand up and tell them about the boy who'd once built model airplanes with patient concentration, who'd learned to fish on mountain streams and could identify bird calls by ear. But grief had made him a stranger even to himself, and he'd left without speaking to anyone, driving straight back to Montana and the cabin that had become both refuge and prison. That was when he'd started trapping for bounty. The state paid good money for wolves and coyotes, predators that threatened livestock and game herds. It was work that suited a man who'd grown comfortable with solitude and death, work that required patience and knowledge of animal behavior, and the kind of ruthless practicality that came naturally to someone who'd lost faith in gentler approaches to life's problems. For 25 years, Jeremiah had set his snares and checked his trap lines, building a reputation as one of the most effective hunters in the region. He knew every game trail for 50 miles, could read tracks like a book, and predict animal behavior with an accuracy that bordered on supernatural. The work paid well enough to keep him in coffee and canned goods, ammunition and kerosene, the basic necessities of a life pared down to its essential elements. But trapping was a young man's profession, and at 67, Jeremiah felt every mile he'd hiked, every night he'd spent sleeping on frozen ground. His knees ached in cold weather, his hands had grown stiff from decades of working in mountain winters, and there were mornings when getting out of bed required a conscious act of will. He'd officially retired 3 years ago, though he still kept a few traps set near the cabin, more from habit than necessity. The silence of retirement had been harder to adjust to than he'd expected. Without the routine of checking trap lines, the days stretched long and empty. He read voraciously, military histories, nature writing, the occasional novel, but books could only fill so many hours. He split wood, maintained his equipment, took long walks through terrain he knew better than his own reflection. But these activities felt like elaborate ways of marking time rather than living it. The loneliness had settled into his bones like arthritis, a dull ache that never quite went away. Sometimes he caught himself talking to the squirrels that raided his bird feeder, or to the photograph of Sarah he kept hidden in his Bible, the only picture he'd been able to bear keeping after the funeral. In town, which he visited once a month for supplies, people still treated him with the cautious respect due to a man with his reputation. But he could see the pity in their eyes, the way they stepped aside when he approached, as if grief and regret were contagious. Martha Hayes, who ran the general store, was one of the few people who still spoke to him like he was human rather than legend. She'd known Sarah, had attended the same church, and she seemed to understand that beneath the reputation was just a tired old man trying to make peace with choices that couldn't be unmade. She always asked after his health, made sure he had everything he needed for the long stretches between visits, and treated him with a kindness he wasn't sure he deserved. The morning light was growing stronger now, turning the falling snow from grey to white. Jeremiah finished his coffee and began the daily ritual of preparing for whatever the day might bring. He checked the fire, added another split log to ensure it would burn steady while he was outside. He pulled on his wool coat, the same military surplus jacket he'd worn for 30 years, and laced up his boots. The Remington hung by the door, loaded and ready. Not because he expected trouble, but because a man alone in the wilderness learned to be prepared for anything. Outside, the cold hit him like a physical blow. The thermometer nailed to the cabin's wall read 18 below zero, cold enough to kill a man who wasn't careful, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. But Jeremiah had made his peace with winter long ago. There was something honest about cold this severe. It demanded respect, attention, the kind of focus that left no room for brooding about the past. He made his way to the woodshed, his breath forming white clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry air. The shed held enough split pine and fir to last through the hardest winter, cut and stacked with the methodical care of a man who understood that preparation was the difference between comfort and survival. He loaded his arms with logs, enough to keep the fire burning through the morning, and trudged back through snow that crunched underfoot like broken glass. As he restacked the wood beside the fireplace, Jeremiah heard something that made him pause. A sound carried on the wind, faint and intermittent, almost lost in the whisper of falling snow. He cocked his head, listening with the practiced attention of a hunter who'd learned to distinguish between the sounds that belonged in the wilderness and those that didn't. There it was again, a cry, high and desperate, echoing off the mountainsides like a prayer without an answer. It was the sound of something in pain, something trapped and frightened, calling out to a world that had forgotten how to listen. Jeremiah set down the armload of wood and reached for his coat. The cry came again as Jeremiah stepped onto his porch, clearer now, cutting through the morning air like a blade through silence. It was a sound he recognized from 30 years of mountain living, the keening wail of something wild and desperate, but with an undertone that spoke of captivity rather than freedom. No animal in the wild made that particular noise, that hopeless repetition of distress that came only from creatures who had learned that calling for help was futile, but couldn't stop themselves from trying. He pulled on his heavy gloves and checked. The rifle slung across his shoulder, then set off through the snow toward the sound. His boots left deep prints in the powder as he navigated between the trees, following a route he knew by heart, even in the white blindness of a snowfall. The cry was coming from the direction of the old Mackenzie logging operation, abandoned 5 years ago when the timber company pulled out and left. Nothing but stumps and broken equipment scattered across 20 acres of scarred mountainside. Jeremiah had avoided the place. Since the loggers departed, there was something deeply sad about industrial ruins in wilderness settings, the way nature slowly reclaimed what men had built and then abandoned. Rusty machinery became islands for moss and lichen. Wooden structures rotted back into the soil they'd been torn from, and animals made dens in the shells of buildings that had once housed the dreams of working men. But today, the sound pulled him forward, growing stronger with each step. As he crested the ridge that overlooked the old camp, he could see the source of the distress, a ramshackle collection of shacks and equipment sheds, half buried in snow and shadow. The cry was coming from somewhere near the main building, a structure that had served as both office and bunkhouse during the operation's brief existence. Jeremiah approached carefully, using the cover of standing timber to mask his movement. Something about the scene felt wrong, beyond the obvious abandonment. There were tracks in the snow around the buildings, but they were several days old, nearly filled by fresh snowfall. Vehicle tracks, probably a truck, leading in and out of the camp. Someone had been here recently, and Jeremiah's instincts, honed by war and wilderness, told him that whoever it was hadn't come for innocent purposes. The cry came again, weaker now but more desperate, and Jeremiah pinpointed its source. A wooden shed behind the main building, its door hanging open on broken hinges. He worked his way closer, using the ruins as cover, until he could see into the shadowed interior of the shed. What he saw there made his breath catch in his throat. In the far corner of the shed, pressed against the rotting wooden walls, sat a cage made of welded steel bars. Inside the cage, barely visible in the dim light, was a wolf pup, though calling it a pup was generous. The animal was perhaps 6 months old enough to be weaned, but still young enough to carry the gangly awkwardness of adolescence. Its coat should have been thick and lustrous with winter growth, but instead it hung in matted clumps. Dull with malnutrition and neglect, the wolf was lying on its side, too weak to stand. But its yellow eyes were alert and fixed on Jeremiah, with an intensity that spoke of intelligence and desperate hope. Around the cage were scattered the remnants of what might once have been food. Mouldy bread, scraps of meat gone green with spoilage, a water dish that had frozen solid days ago. The stench was overwhelming, a mixture of waste and rot, and the particular smell of suffering that Jeremiah remembered from field hospitals and prisoner-of-war camps. But it was the wolf's eyes that held him transfixed. There was something human in that gaze, something that reminded him of his own reflection in mirrors he'd learned to avoid. Pain, yes, but also a kind of resigned acceptance that spoke of betrayal by creatures the animal had once trusted. This wolf had known human kindness once, had learned to expect care and protection, only to find itself abandoned to die alone in the cold. Jeremiah's hands were shaking as he approached the cage, and not from the cold. Hanging on a nail driven into the shed's wall was an old steel trap, its jaws rust-stained, but still sharp enough to break bone. It was the kind of snare he'd once used himself, back in the days when he'd trapped wolves for bounty money, when he'd convinced himself that predators were just another form of enemy to be eliminated for the greater good. The sight of that trap sent a wave of self-loathing through him, so powerful he had to lean against the shed's wall for support. How many wolves had he killed over the years? How many had died in agony, waiting for him to arrive and end their suffering with a bullet? He'd told himself it was necessary work, that he was protecting livestock and maintaining the balance of nature. But looking at this dying pup, he saw his life's work for what it truly was, a long campaign of cruelty justified by need and payment. The wolf whimpered, a sound barely louder than a whisper, and tried to lift its head. The movement seemed to exhaust it, and it collapsed back onto its side, ribs showing clearly through the matted fur. Jeremiah could see that it was a female, probably taken from her pack as a very young pup, raised by humans until she grew large enough to be inconvenient, then caged and abandoned when her captors lost interest or ran out of money to feed her. He knelt beside the cage, speaking in the low, gentle tones he'd once used to calm wounded soldiers in Vietnam. "Easy there, girl, easy now. I'm not going to hurt you." The wolf's ears flicked toward his voice, but she didn't try to move away. She was beyond fear now, too weak for anything but the faint hope that this new human might be different from the ones who'd left her here to die. The cage door was secured with a simple bolt, rusted but still functional. Jeremiah's military training screamed warnings about approaching a wild animal, even one in this condition. But something deeper than caution was driving him now. He'd spent 30 years running from his own capacity for compassion, convincing himself that caring too much was a luxury he couldn't afford, a weakness that led only to pain and loss. But looking at this wolf, he saw something he recognized, another soul that had been betrayed by those it trusted, abandoned by a world that had used it up and discarded it when it was no longer convenient. The parallel was too clear to ignore, too personal to walk away from. He reached for the bolt, then stopped. If he opened this cage, he would be crossing a line he'd drawn around his heart 30 years ago. This wolf would become his responsibility, another creature he could fail, another loss waiting to happen. Every instinct told him to walk away, to report the animal to the state wildlife department and let them handle it, to preserve the careful distance he'd maintained between himself and anything that might matter to him. The wolf's eyes found his again, and in that gaze he saw an intelligence that seemed almost human, a desperate plea that went beyond the simple need for food and shelter. She was asking him to care, to risk his heart on a creature that might not survive another day, might not be capable of trust, might turn on him the moment she recovered her strength. Jeremiah thought about his son, dying alone in California without knowing his father had spent 20 years wanting to call him, wanting to ask forgiveness, wanting to find some way to bridge the gap that pride and pain had opened between them. He thought about Sarah, enduring years of his silence and distance, loving a man who'd forgotten how to love himself. He thought about all the chances he'd missed, all the moments when he could have chosen connection over safety, love over self-preservation. The wolf whimpered again, and this time the sound seemed to come from his own throat. Jeremiah reached for the bolt and slid it free. The cage door swung open with a rusty squeal, and for the first time in 30 years, he allowed himself to care about something that could break his heart. "Don't be afraid." "Oh, kid," he whispered, reaching slowly into the cage. "I'm getting you out." The wolf was lighter than Jeremiah had expected, her body nothing but bones and matted fur wrapped in skin that hung loose from dehydration. She didn't struggle when he lifted her from the cage, too weak for resistance. But her eyes remained fixed on his face with an intensity that suggested she was cataloguing every detail of this new human who had chosen to touch her with gentle hands instead of cruel ones. Jeremiah cradled her against his chest, feeling the rapid flutter of her heartbeat through his heavy coat. She smelled of filth and fear, but underneath those harsh odors was something else, the clean, wild scent that belonged to creatures who had never forgotten their true nature, no matter what humans had done to them. He wrapped his coat around her as best he could and began the long trek back to his cabin, moving carefully through the snow to avoid jarring her fragile body. The journey that normally took him 20 minutes stretched to nearly an hour. He had to stop frequently to rest, not from the wolf's weight, but from the careful attention required to keep her stable. Each time he paused, she would lift her head slightly and look around, with the alertness of an animal who had learned that safety was always temporary, that the next moment might bring new cruelty or abandonment. "We're almost home," he found himself saying, the word strange in his mouth. He hadn't used that word in years. Home. The cabin had been shelter, refuge, hiding place, but never home. Home implied something worth returning to, people who waited for you. Warmth that went deeper than a well-tended fire. When they reached the cabin, Jeremiah kicked the snow off his boots and carried the wolf directly to the fireplace. The warmth hit them both like a physical embrace, and for the first time since he'd found her, the wolf seemed to relax slightly. Her breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, began to slow to something closer to normal. He laid her on the braided rug in front of the fire, then knelt beside her to assess the damage more clearly. In the full light of his kerosene lamps, the extent of her suffering was even more apparent. Her coat was patchy with malnutrition, her ribs clearly visible, her hip bones sharp angles beneath loose skin. There were sores around her neck where a collar had rubbed, and her paws showed signs of frostbite from the metal cage floor, but her eyes were clear, and when he spoke to her, her ears would prick forward with attention. Whatever else had been done to her, her spirit hadn't been completely broken. Jeremiah had tended wounded animals before. It was an unavoidable part of life in the wilderness, but this felt different. This required a gentleness he wasn't sure he still possessed, a patience with vulnerability that went against every lesson his adult life had taught him. Vulnerability was dangerous. Caring was a luxury that led to loss. He started with water, offering it to her in a shallow bowl he normally used for his own meals. She lifted her head with visible effort and lapped at it gratefully, though she could only manage a few drops before exhaustion forced her to rest again. The sight of her struggle to perform this basic function of survival filled Jeremiah with a rage so pure and focused it surprised him. Someone had done this to her deliberately, had taken a wild creature and reduced it to this state through neglect and cruelty. For the first time in years, his military training asserted itself not as a source of nightmares, but as a practical skill set. Triage. Assess the most critical needs first. She needed hydration, warmth, and food in that order. Everything else could wait until she was stable. He heated water on the wood stove and soaked strips of cloth from an old sheet, using them to clean the worst of the filth from her coat. She submitted to this attention with the resignation of an animal who had learned that resistance was futile. But as he worked, he thought he detected something else in her stillness, a growing awareness that these hands meant help, not harm. While he worked, his mind wandered to memories he'd tried to bury. Michael at age 8, nursing an injured sparrow they'd found in the yard, his small hands impossibly gentle as he helped his father set the bird's broken wing with popsicle stick splints and medical tape. Sarah watching from the kitchen window, smiling at the sight of her 2 men bent over their tiny patient with such serious concentration. The sparrow had died anyway, despite their care, and Michael had cried with the particular heartbreak of childhood, when every loss seems both personal and permanent. Jeremiah had tried to explain that sometimes caring wasn't enough, that good intentions couldn't always overcome the damage that had already been done. Then why try? Michael had asked, and Jeremiah had given him some adult answer about doing what you could and accepting what you couldn't change. But looking back, he wondered if what he'd really been teaching his son was that caring too much was a weakness. That emotional distance was safer than investment. Maybe that was why Michael had grown up unable to trust love, unable to believe that anyone would stay when staying became difficult. Maybe his son had learned too well the lesson that Jeremiah himself had absorbed in a jungle hospital tent 30 years earlier. That attachment was dangerous. That the people you cared about were the ones who could destroy you most completely when they left. The wolf stirred under his ministrations, and he realized he'd been sitting motionless for several minutes, lost in memories that felt both distant and immediate. She was looking at him with those unsettling yellow eyes, and he had the strange sensation that she understood something about grief, about the weight of caring for things you couldn't save. "Hungry girl?" he asked softly. She didn't react to the word, but her nostrils flared at the scent that clung to his clothes: coffee, wood smoke, and the lingering aroma of the venison stew he'd made 2 days earlier. In his small kitchen, Jeremiah found the remains of that stew and heated it slowly, mashing the meat and vegetables into a consistency she might be able to manage. He'd read somewhere that starving animals needed to be fed carefully, that too much food too quickly could kill them as surely as starvation. But he'd never had to put that knowledge into practice, never had to calculate how much hope to offer a creature who'd been taught to expect betrayal. He returned to the fireplace with a shallow wooden bowl he'd carved years earlier from a piece of pine burl. It was rough work, nothing fancy, but it was clean and smooth and sized for human hands. Now he found himself wondering if it might serve a different purpose. If something he'd made for his own solitary meals might become part of a routine that included another living soul. The wolf lifted her head when he approached, and this time there was something different in her posture. Not just resignation, but a kind of cautious hope. She watched as he set the bowl beside her, then lowered her muzzle to investigate the contents. Her tail, which had been motionless since he'd found her, gave a single tentative wag. It was the first sign of trust she'd shown, and it hit Jeremiah like a blow to the chest. Such a small gesture, but it suggested that somewhere beneath the damage and fear, she remembered what it felt like to believe that good things were possible. "That's it, girl," he whispered, watching her eat with the slow, careful movements of someone who had learned not to take food for granted. "That's it. You're safe now." 3 days passed before the wolf could stand without swaying, and a full week before she showed interest in anything beyond eating and sleeping. Jeremiah found his daily routine reshaping itself around her needs, warming water for her to drink, preparing small meals throughout the day, checking on her breathing while she slept curled by the fire. He'd forgotten how much space another living creature could occupy in a man's thoughts, how the simple act of responsibility could give shape and meaning to hours that had previously felt empty. He named her Ghost on the fourth day, when he woke to find her standing by the window, pale coat catching the morning light as she watched snow fall beyond the glass. There was something ethereal about her appearance, the way she seemed to fade into the white world outside, and something haunted in her stillness that reminded him of his own relationship with the past, always present but never quite solid, never quite real. The name seemed to suit her. She moved through the cabin like a spirit, padding silently on healing paws, appearing and disappearing from his peripheral vision with the fluid grace that belonged to wild things, even wounded ones. But unlike the ghosts that haunted his sleep, her presence brought comfort rather than torment. Morning. Ghost, he would say when he rose to tend the fire, and her ears would perk forward at the sound of her name. She was learning the rhythms of human speech, beginning to understand that certain sounds were directed at her, carried meaning beyond simple noise. Her intelligence was becoming more apparent as her strength returned, the way she watched him move around the cabin, cataloging his routines, learning to predict when meals would appear or when he might settle beside her for the evening. By the second week, she had claimed the space in front of the fireplace as her territory, arranging herself on the braided rug with the proprietary confidence of a creature who understood she belonged there. The sight of her sleeping peacefully in his home stirred emotions Jeremiah had thought buried beyond resurrection. Protectiveness, yes, but also something warmer and more dangerous. Pride in her recovery, pleasure in her growing trust. The simple joy of sharing space with something alive and aware. He found himself talking to her more each day, narrating his activities as he went about the business of maintaining their shared existence. Need to split more wood today, Ghost. Getting low, and the weather report says more snow coming. She would listen with the serious attention of someone following a conversation she couldn't quite understand but found interesting anyway. The talks grew longer and more personal as the days passed. Sitting by the fire in the evenings, with Ghost stretched out beside his chair, Jeremiah began to speak about things he'd never said aloud, not even to Sarah in the early years of their marriage when she'd still believed she could help him heal. Had a son once, he told her one night, watching the flames dance over her sleeping form. About your size when you were born, I imagine. Small enough to hold in one hand, but already stubborn as hell. His mother used to say he got that from me. Ghost's ear flicked toward his voice, but she didn't lift her head. Somehow her sleepy attention felt safer than the direct gaze of human eyes, less demanding of explanations or justifications. Named him Michael. Sarah picked it, said it meant gift from God, and that's what he was to us. To her, anyway. I was so scared of breaking him that I barely held him for the first month. Hands like mine, they're made for breaking things, you know? Killing things. Didn't seem right to touch something so clean and perfect. The confession hung in the warm air of the cabin, and Jeremiah waited for the familiar surge of self-loathing that usually accompanied thoughts of his failures as a father. But with Ghost's steady breathing, providing counterpoint to his words, the pain felt more manageable somehow, like a wound that was finally beginning to heal. Hidden in his Bible, pressed between pages that spoke of redemption and forgiveness, was the last photograph he owned of his family, taken at Michael's high school graduation. 3 people standing close together but somehow separate, each dealing with private pain in their own way. Sarah, beautiful even in her illness, wearing the brave smile she'd perfected for public occasions. Michael, 18 and eager to escape, his eyes already showing the restlessness that would carry him to California and destruction. And Jeremiah himself, standing slightly apart even in the family grouping, as if he couldn't quite believe he deserved to be in the picture. He'd looked at that photograph exactly once since Michael's funeral, then closed the Bible and hadn't opened it since. But now, with Ghost's presence making the cabin feel less like a tomb and more like a home, he found himself thinking about retrieving it, maybe even displaying it somewhere she could see. Not because she would understand its significance, but because having a witness to his memories, even a non-human one, made them feel less like shameful secrets and more like simple facts of a life lived imperfectly, but with good intentions. "He would have liked you," Jeremiah said, and realized it was true. Michael had always been drawn to strays and wounded things, a compassion that had made him vulnerable to the wrong kind of people in his adult years, but had also marked him as someone who understood that suffering created its own form of kinship, as if responding to the mention of someone important. Ghost lifted her head and looked at him directly for the first time that evening. Her yellow eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, and for a moment Jeremiah had the unsettling feeling that she understood more than any animal should, that she was offering him something approaching sympathy. "You remind me of him sometimes," he continued, reaching down to stroke her head with fingers that had grown sure and gentle in their handling of her. "Got that same stubborn streak, that same way of watching the world like you're trying to figure out if it's safe to trust it." Ghost leaned into his touch. A gesture that would have been unremarkable in a domestic dog, but felt like a gift from a creature who had every reason to fear human hands. Her trust was earned daily, built through consistent kindness and respect for her wild nature. Unlike human relationships, which could be poisoned by history and expectation, this bond was clean and present-focused, based on actions rather than words, on what he did rather than what he'd failed to do in the past. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows and sending snow spirals across the yard. But inside, warmed by fire and the quiet breathing of his unlikely companion, Jeremiah felt something he'd almost forgotten existed: contentment. Not happiness, which seemed too much to ask for, but the simple satisfaction of being needed, of having purpose beyond mere survival. For the first time in 30 years, he wasn't entirely alone. By the third week, Ghost had recovered enough strength to venture outside for brief periods, always staying close to the cabin, always keeping Jeremiah in sight. She moved through the snow with the fluid grace of her kind, but there was something different about her gait, a subtle hesitation that spoke of learned wariness. She'd been betrayed by humans before, and while she was learning to trust Jeremiah, her instincts hadn't forgotten the lesson that safety could be revoked without warning. Jeremiah watched her from the porch as she investigated the perimeter of his property, noting how she marked certain trees and rocks with her scent, claiming territory in the way of wild things. But she never strayed far, and when he called her name, she would return immediately, ears pricked forward, tail held in the neutral position that suggested alertness rather than submission or dominance. It was during one of these outdoor excursions that he first noticed the tracks. They were human footprints, partially filled with fresh snow, but still clearly visible to eyes trained in reading sign. Someone had been watching the cabin, had stood among the trees beyond the woodshed for an extended period, long enough to leave deep impressions where they'd shifted their weight from foot to foot. The tracks were large, made by heavy boots, and they led to and from a vantage point that provided a clear view of Jeremiah's front door and windows. Jeremiah felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with the recognition of potential threat, the hyper-alertness that had kept him alive in Vietnam and during his early years as a trapper. He'd lived alone in these mountains long enough to know that honest visitors announced themselves, knocked on doors, made noise. People who watched from concealment usually had reasons they preferred not to discuss. He called Ghost back to the cabin and spent the next hour examining the tracks more carefully, reading the story they told. A single person, probably male based on the size and stride length, had approached his property sometime in the past 48 hours. The intruder had worn quality boots, expensive ones based on the tread pattern, and had moved with the confidence of someone familiar with wilderness travel. Most troubling was the length of time the person had spent watching. The disturbed snow suggested at least an hour of observation, maybe more. That kind of patience spoke of professional interest rather than casual curiosity. Someone wanted to know about his routines, his habits, his vulnerabilities. The old military compass sat on his mantelpiece, its needle spinning uselessly after decades of wear and magnetic drift. Jeremiah had carried it through 3 tours of duty, had relied on it to navigate jungle terrain where getting lost meant death. But like so many things from that time in his life, it had gradually failed him. Its precision eroded by time and use until it became more symbol than tool, a reminder of how even the most reliable things could lose their way. Now, studying the tracks that circled his sanctuary, he felt that same sense of directional confusion, the understanding that the safe haven he'd built might not be as secure as he'd believed. Someone was interested in him, in Ghost, in the life they'd begun building together. And in his experience, unseen interest was rarely benevolent. That evening, he double-checked the locks on his doors and made sure the Remington was loaded and within easy reach. Ghost seemed to sense his tension, staying closer than usual. Her yellow eyes alert to sounds and scents that didn't belong to their established routine. "Looks like we might have company coming," he told her as they settled by the fire. Uninvited kind, most likely. She tilted her head at the serious tone in his voice, and he realized she was learning to read his moods as well as his words, developing the emotional intelligence that had made wolves successful pack hunters for millennia. She understood that something had changed in their small world, that the human she'd learned to trust was preparing for some form of conflict. The next morning brought fresh snow and no new tracks, but Jeremiah's unease persisted. He found himself checking the windows more frequently, scanning the tree line for movement that didn't belong to wind or wildlife. Ghost picked up on his vigilance and began exhibiting behaviors he hadn't seen before, freezing in mid-step to listen to sounds he couldn't hear, positioning herself between him and the windows when they were inside. Staying alert even when resting, her wild instincts were reasserting themselves, sharpened by the growing strength in her body and the subtle threat neither of them could quite identify. She was becoming what she'd always been meant to be, a predator, a survivor, a creature capable of defending what mattered to her. The realization troubled Jeremiah more than he wanted to admit. Part of him had begun to imagine that Ghost might choose to stay with him permanently, that the bond they'd formed might prove stronger than her natural instincts. But watching her pace the cabin's perimeter with renewed awareness, he understood that her recovery meant more than just physical healing. She was remembering what it meant to be free, to trust her own judgment rather than depending entirely on human protection. 3 days passed without incident, and Jeremiah began to wonder if he was reading too much into what might have been innocent tracks, a lost hiker, perhaps, or someone seeking shelter who'd changed their mind about asking for help. But on the 4th morning, Ghost refused to go outside for her usual exploration, instead positioning herself by the door with hackles raised. A low growl rumbling in her chest, Jeremiah followed her gaze through the window and saw them, 3 men moving through the trees with the careful spacing of people who understood tactical approach. They weren't trying to hide their presence anymore, which meant they were confident enough in their purpose to abandon stealth for direct action. He recognized the type, even at a distance. Hard men who made their living in the spaces between legal and illegal, who viewed the wilderness as a place where normal rules didn't apply. And poachers most likely, or black market traders who dealt in things that couldn't be sold in legitimate markets, and they were walking toward his cabin with the deliberate pace of people who had come to collect something they considered their property. Ghost's growl deepened, and Jeremiah reached for his rifle, understanding that the peaceful interlude of recovery and bonding was over. Whatever these men wanted, they hadn't come to ask politely, and they clearly weren't planning to take no for an answer. The compass on his mantelpiece spun wildly, as if reflecting the sudden disruption of the magnetic field that had surrounded his ordered life. But for the first time in years, Jeremiah felt his own internal compass steady and true, pointing toward a purpose he could understand, protecting what mattered to him, regardless of the cost. "Easy, Ghost," he whispered, checking the rifle's action with practiced efficiency. "Looks like we're about to find out what we're both made of." The three men approached with the unhurried confidence of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. Jeremiah watched them through his window, cataloging details with the automatic assessment that had kept him alive in hostile territory decades earlier. The leader was a big man, with the kind of heavy build that suggested strength rather than fat, moving with the balanced gait of someone comfortable with violence. The other two flanked him at intervals that spoke of practiced coordination. They'd worked together before, knew each other's capabilities and tendencies. They stopped about 30 yards from the cabin, just beyond easy rifle range, but close enough to make their intentions clear. The leader cupped his hands around his mouth and called out in a voice that carried easily across the snow-muffled landscape, "Morning, old-timer. Need to have a word with you about some property that's gone missing." Jeremiah stepped onto his porch, the Remington held casually but ready, Ghost pressed against his leg like a pale shadow. Up close, the men looked exactly as he'd expected, the kind of hard-used individuals who made their living in the grey spaces where law enforcement rarely ventured. Their clothes were expensive but practical, their boots designed for serious wilderness work, and each of them carried the subtle bulge of concealed weapons with the casual familiarity of professional habit. "Property," Jeremiah called back, keeping his voice level and conversational. "This is all my land, boys. Posted and legally owned for 30 years. You're trespassing." The leader smiled, but it was the kind of expression that held no warmth, the social mask that dangerous men wore when they were still pretending to be reasonable. "Now that's not exactly what I'm talking about, friend. See, we had ourselves a wolf up at the old logging camp. Valuable animal, that one. Worth considerable money to the right buyer. But someone went and took her out of her cage, and that someone lives right about here." Ghost pressed closer to Jeremiah's leg, her body tense with recognition. These were the voices she remembered, the humans who had caged her and left her to die. Her lips pulled back slightly, revealing teeth that had grown sharp and strong during her weeks of recovery, and the sound that came from her throat was nothing like the weak whimpers he'd first heard at the logging camp. "Don't know anything about any wolf," Jeremiah replied, though his grip tightened on the rifle. "But I can tell you that if you had an animal caged up there, you were breaking about 6 different federal laws. Wolves are protected in this state." The leader's companion, a lean man with the twitchy alertness of someone who relied more on speed than strength, spat into the snow and laughed. "Protected hell. That's our stock, bred and raised special for private collectors. Got papers on her and everything. It was a lie, and they all knew it. No legitimate breeder would have left an animal to starve in an abandoned building, and no legal operation would require the kind of secrecy these men obviously preferred. But they were making their claim anyway, establishing their version of justification for whatever they planned to do next. "Even if that were true," Jeremiah said, "which it isn't, you've got no right coming onto private property making demands. You want to pursue some legal claim, you can contact the sheriff's office like civilized people." The third man, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward slightly. He was older than the other two, gray-haired and weathered, with the kind of patience that suggested he was accustomed to being the final authority in conversations like this one. "Problem with that approach," he said in a voice like gravel over steel, "is that Sheriff Martinez might start asking questions about our other business interests. Questions that could get complicated for everyone involved. Easier to handle this between ourselves, man to man." Ghost's growl deepened, and Jeremiah could feel the tension in her body like a coiled spring. She recognized not just these voices, but the threat they represented, the casual cruelty that had shaped her understanding of human nature before she'd met him. Her yellow eyes were fixed on the gray-haired man with an intensity that suggested she remembered him specifically, remembered him as the source of particular pain. "That's her." "All right," the lean man said, having noticed Ghost's reaction. "Look how she's watching us." Knows exactly who we are, don't you, girl? The way I see it, the gray-haired leader continued, you've got something that belongs to us. Now maybe you found her and thought you were doing a good deed, taking in a stray. I can respect that impulse in a man. But she's valuable property, and we need her back. Jeremiah had dealt with men like this before, in Vietnam and in the years afterward, when his reputation as a trapper had brought him into contact with people who operated on the margins of legality. They spoke in reasonable tones and used civilized language, but underneath the polite words was a simple equation: give us what we want or face the consequences. The difference was that 30 years ago, he'd been a man with nothing left to lose. Now, with Ghost pressed against his leg, he discovered he had something worth protecting again, something worth taking risks to keep safe, hidden away in his leather journal, pressed between pages that chronicled his failures as a husband and father, were entries about Michael that he'd never shown anyone, observations about his son's developing personality, pride in small accomplishments, fears about the kind of man the boy might become. The journal had been Sarah's idea, a way to process his feelings about fatherhood without burdening his family with the complexities of his emotional landscape. He'd stopped writing in it after Michael left for California, unable to bear the reminder of connections severed by pride and poor timing. But looking at these three men who had come to claim Ghost like a piece of property, he thought about those old entries, about the fierce protectiveness that had once defined his relationship with his son. That protectiveness had been corrupted by his own damage, twisted into the kind of emotional distance that had driven Michael away. But the core feeling remained intact, the understanding that some things were worth fighting for, worth risking everything to defend. Here's the problem with your proposal, Jeremiah said, shifting the rifle to a more ready position. Even if I believed your story about ownership, which I don't, this wolf isn't going anywhere. She's made her choice about where she wants to be, and I'm inclined to respect that. The grey-haired man's expression hardened, dropping the pretense of reasonable negotiation. Old man, you're making a mistake that's going to cost you more than you can afford. Maybe so, Jeremiah replied, feeling Ghost's warmth against his leg, like an anchor to purpose he'd thought lost forever. But some mistakes are worth making. The standoff might have escalated to violence immediately, if not for Ghost's sudden change in behavior. As the grey-haired man reached inside his coat, she stepped forward and lifted her head, exposing something Jeremiah had never noticed before, a band of lighter fur around her neck, almost invisible against her pale coat unless the light hit it just right. Wait, the lean man said, squinting at Ghost with newfound interest. Check her neck, boss. There's something there. The grey-haired leader pulled out a pair of compact binoculars and focused on Ghost. After a moment, his expression shifted from irritation to something approaching excitement. Son of a bitch. She's still wearing it. Wearing what? Jeremiah demanded. But even as he asked the question, he was running his fingers through Ghost's neck fur, feeling for whatever the men had spotted. His fingers found it immediately, a thin band of metal, lightweight and smooth, hidden so perfectly beneath her winter coat that he'd missed it entirely during weeks of caring for her. It was a collar, but unlike any he'd ever seen. Instead of leather or nylon, it appeared to be made from some kind of advanced polymer, flexible enough to be comfortable, but obviously sophisticated in its construction. As he manipulated it carefully, trying not to alarm Ghost, he found what felt like electronic components embedded in the material. That there's a tracking collar, the grey-haired man said, lowering his binoculars with a satisfied smile. Military-grade, GPS-enabled, worth about $15,000 on its own. But it's not the collar we're after. It's the data it's been collecting. Jeremiah's military experience had taught him to recognize the moment when a situation revealed layers he hadn't suspected, when what seemed like a straightforward conflict suddenly became something more complex and dangerous. This was one of those moments. What kind of data? He asked, though he suspected the answer would complicate his life in ways he wasn't prepared for. The lean man laughed, a sound without humor. That wolf isn't just any animal, old man. She's part of a federal reintroduction program, bred from the last genetic line of the original Montana wolf population. Her bloodline goes back to wolves that lived in these mountains 100 years ago, before hunting and development wiped them out. Ghost seemed to sense the change in tension, pressing closer to Jeremiah's leg while keeping her eyes fixed on the three men. Her behavior suggested recognition, not just of their voices, but of their scent, their mannerisms, the particular threat they represented. She'd been with these people long enough to learn their individual characteristics, to understand which one was most dangerous. The collar's been tracking her movements for 18 months, the gray-haired leader continued. Every territory she's explored, every game trail she's used, every den site her pack established before we acquired her. That information is worth more than the wolf herself to certain parties. What parties? Jeremiah asked, though the cold certainty in his stomach suggested he already knew. Developers, the third man said, speaking for the first time since they'd made their opening demands. People who need to know where the endangered species are before they start clearing land for ski resorts and shopping centers. Turns out it's a lot cheaper to pay for advanced intelligence than to halt construction when some tree hugger finds protected animals on your property. The scope of what they were describing hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. Ghost wasn't just a wolf. She was a living map of critical habitat, a GPS record of the territories her pack had used for hunting, denning, and raising young. In the wrong hands, that information could be used to systematically eliminate the last refuges of her species. All in the name of development and profit. Course, there's also the breeding program, the lean man added, with the casual tone of someone discussing livestock. Rich folks pay big money for exotic pets, especially ones with this kind of pedigree. Wolf with a bloodline this pure, she could produce cubs worth 50,000 each to the right buyers. Ghost's lips pulled back in a silent snarl, and Jeremiah understood that she comprehended more of this conversation than any animal should. She knew what these men represented, knew what they had planned for her, and any offspring she might produce. The intelligence in her yellow eyes was sharp and aware, suggesting a level of understanding that went beyond simple animal instinct. You killed her pack, Jeremiah said, the pieces of the story falling into place with horrible clarity. That's how you got her, the gray-haired leader shrugged. Market forces. Pack was getting too established, too visible. Fish and Wildlife was starting to pay attention, talking about expanding protection zones. Bad for our clients' long-term interests. So you murdered an entire family of endangered animals for money, Jeremiah said, feeling a rage so pure it threatened to overwhelm his tactical thinking. We eliminated a business obstacle, the man corrected. The girl there was just a bonus. Young enough to be manageable, old enough to breed, and carrying all that valuable tracking data. Perfect package deal. Ghost's reaction to these revelations was immediate and visceral. The weak, dying animal Jeremiah had found in the cage was gone, replaced by something that remembered what it meant to be apex predator. Her hackles rose, her body shifted into the balanced crouch of a hunter preparing to strike, and the sound coming from her throat was unlike anything he'd heard from her before. A vocalization that spoke of grief and fury in frequencies that seemed to resonate in his bones. She knows what you did, Jeremiah said, understanding finally why Ghost had been so close to death when he'd found her. It hadn't been just starvation and neglect. It had been grief, the profound depression that came from witnessing the destruction of everything familiar and safe. Smart girl, the gray-haired man acknowledged. Watch the whole thing. Might have died from pure stubbornness if you hadn't come along and given her a reason to keep living. The casual admission of genocide, delivered with the emotional investment of someone discussing the weather, crystallized something in Jeremiah that had been building since he'd first found Ghost in that cage. These weren't just criminals, they were representatives of a system that reduced living creatures to profit margins, that viewed the natural world as nothing more than inventory to be managed and exploited. You're not taking her, he said. the words carrying the finality of a man who had made peace with the consequences of his choices. "Now, that's where you're wrong," the leader replied, reaching inside his coat again. "See, we've got legal papers saying she belongs to us. Got a federal permit for captive breeding of endangered species, all signed and official. You're harboring stolen property, old man, and that makes you a criminal." He pulled out a folded document, but Jeremiah didn't need to examine it to know it would look authentic. Men like these had resources, connections, the kind of corrupt legitimacy that money could purchase from officials who preferred not to ask uncomfortable questions about where certain animals came from or how they'd been obtained, even if that paper's real. Jeremiah said, "Which I doubt. It doesn't change what you are. You're butchers, and I'm not letting you take her." Ghost moved then, positioning herself between Jeremiah and the three men with the fluid grace of a creature who had decided that words had gone on long enough. Her body language had shifted completely, no longer the recovering victim seeking protection, but something primal and dangerous, a reminder of what wolves had been before humans taught them to fear. The gray-haired leader smiled, but there was something different in his expression now, a recognition that the situation had moved beyond simple intimidation into territory where violence was not just possible, but inevitable. "Well then," he said, drawing a pistol from beneath his coat, "I guess we'll have to do this the hard way." The moment stretched taut as a bowstring, everyone frozen in the crystalline air of the mountain morning. Jeremiah could feel his pulse steady and slow, his breathing becoming controlled and deliberate, the autonomic response of a soldier who had learned to function in the space between decision and action. Ghost remained motionless beside him, but he could sense the coiled energy in her body, the predator's calculation of distance and opportunity. Then the sound of an engine cut through the silence, growing louder as it climbed the winding road that led to Jeremiah's property. All eyes turned toward the tree line where the sound was coming from, and after a moment, a battered pickup truck emerged from behind the screen of pine and fir, snow chains clanking as it navigated the last steep section of the drive. "Well, hell," the lean man muttered, recognizing a complication they hadn't planned for. The truck was Martha Hayes's ancient Ford, the same vehicle she'd been driving for 20 years, held together by determination and mechanical sympathy. She pulled to a stop about halfway between the cabin and the three intruders, then climbed out with the deliberate movements of someone who had arthritis, but refused to let it slow her down. "Morning. Jeremiah," she called, her voice carrying clearly across the snow. "Brought you that medical supply order you asked for." She hefted a canvas bag from the truck bed, then seemed to notice the three men for the first time. "Oh, didn't realize you had company." Martha Hayes was 73 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and had the kind of steel-gray hair that suggested she'd stopped caring about vanity sometime in the 1980s, but she also had the sharp intelligence of someone who had run a successful business for 40 years, and Jeremiah could see her taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of a woman who understood when situations were dangerous. "These gentlemen were just leaving," Jeremiah said, keeping his voice steady, but letting Martha know that her arrival had interrupted something serious. The gray-haired leader looked from Martha to Jeremiah, calculating new variables in what had been a straightforward equation. Killing one reclusive old man in the mountains was one thing. Witnesses complicated everything, especially witnesses who knew when you'd been there and what you'd looked like. "Actually," Martha said, setting the medical supplies down and reaching into the truck cab, "I was hoping to have a word with you boys. See, I got curious about those expensive vehicles I've been seeing on the mountain roads lately. Don't get many visitors up here with out-of-state plates and government-grade communications equipment." She emerged from the truck, holding something that made all three men tense, a handheld radio, the kind used by search and rescue teams and federal law enforcement. The device was crackling with static, but underneath the white noise was the unmistakable cadence of official radio traffic. "Turns out," Martha continued conversationally, "the Fish and Wildlife Service has been looking for some folks who might have information about missing wolves from their reintroduction program. Seems there's been some illegal trapping going on. Some animals gone missing from their monitoring systems. The lean man's hand moved toward his weapon, but the gray-haired leader stopped him with a sharp gesture. Too many variables now, too many ways for this to go wrong. Martha might be just a local store owner, but she was holding federal communications equipment and clearly knew more about their operation than they'd anticipated. Now, I called them when I saw your tracks around Jeremiah's place, Martha continued, because that seemed like the neighborly thing to do. And you know what they told me? They told me to keep my distance and wait for backup, because the people they're looking for are considered armed and extremely dangerous. Ghost had been following this conversation with the intense attention of someone who understood that the balance of power was shifting. When Martha mentioned federal agents, her ears pricked forward, and she looked at Jeremiah with what seemed like hopeful expectation. Problem is, Martha added, consulting an old-fashioned watch pinned to her coat, backup's not supposed to arrive for another hour, so we're all just going to have to wait here together until they show up. The gray-haired leader's facade of civilized negotiation finally cracked completely. Lady, you have no idea what you're interfering with. This is bigger than some missing animals. Oh, I think I have a pretty good idea, Martha replied calmly. See, I've been taking care of folks in these mountains for 40 years. I know when someone's hurting, and I know when someone's healing. That wolf's been healing here with Jeremiah, which tells me she chose to stay. Which tells me she's not your property, no matter what papers you might be carrying. Jeremiah felt a surge of gratitude for Martha's unexpected arrival and shrewd assessment of the situation. But he also recognized that her presence had raised the stakes dramatically. These men were facing federal charges if they were caught, which meant they had nothing to lose by eliminating witnesses. The radio in Martha's hand crackled again, and this time a clear voice came through. Base to Unit 7. What's your ETA on the mountain location? Unit 7 to base, Martha responded with practiced ease, holding position at the target location. Multiple subjects on site, situation stable but requires immediate backup. It was a bluff. Jeremiah could tell from her tone that Martha was improvising, using official-sounding language to create the impression of federal surveillance. But it was a good bluff, delivered with the confidence of someone who had listened to enough radio traffic to sound authentic. The three men exchanged glances, and Jeremiah could see them recalculating their options. Originally, they'd planned to take Ghost and eliminate any witnesses, then disappear into the wilderness before anyone knew they'd been there. Now they were facing the possibility of federal agents arriving at any moment, plus 2 local residents who clearly knew more about their operation than they'd anticipated. Here's what's going to happen, the gray-haired leader said, drawing his pistol but keeping it pointed at the ground. We're going to take the wolf and leave. Nobody gets hurt. Everybody goes home to their families. But if you try to stop us, if you interfere with our business, people are going to die today. Ghost's response was immediate and unmistakable. The sound that came from her throat was nothing like the whimpers Jeremiah had first heard at the logging camp. It was the hunting cry of an apex predator, a vocalization that spoke of genetic memory going back thousands of years to a time when wolves feared nothing that walked on 2 legs. She stepped forward, placing herself directly between the armed men and the 2 humans she had chosen to protect. Her body language had shifted completely. No longer the recovering victim, no longer even the healing companion who had shared his fireside. This was something primal and dangerous, a reminder of what wolves had been before humans had nearly driven them to extinction. Easy, Ghost, Jeremiah said softly, recognizing that she was preparing for violence with the same calm professionalism he'd once brought to combat situations. Easy, girl. But he was reaching for his own weapon as he spoke, the old hunting rifle that had served him faithfully for 30 years. His movements were smooth and practiced, muscle memory taking over from conscious thought as he brought the gun to ready position. Martha stepped behind her truck, using the engine block for cover while keeping the radio visible. "Unit 7 to base," she called again. "Subjects are armed and showing hostile intent. Request immediate support." The grey-haired leader's patience finally snapped. "Enough!" he shouted, raising his pistol toward Martha. "Drop that radio and step away from the truck, or I'll—" He never finished the sentence. Ghost launched herself forward with the explosive power of a creature built for bringing down animals much larger than herself. Her leap carried her across 15 feet of snow in a single bound, and she hit the grey-haired man's center mass with the focused impact of 80 pounds of muscle, bone, and centuries of evolutionary perfection. The man's pistol discharged as he fell backward, the bullet going wild into the trees. Ghost's momentum carried them both to the ground, and suddenly the careful standoff became a desperate melee as the other two men drew their weapons, and Jeremiah brought his rifle to bear on targets that were moving too fast for clean shots. "Federal agents!" Martha shouted into her radio, abandoning any pretense of official procedure. "Shots fired! Officer down!" But Jeremiah wasn't listening to her improvised distress call. His attention was focused entirely on Ghost, who was locked in mortal combat with a man twice her weight, using every advantage her wild nature provided against an opponent who had underestimated what he was facing. The old hunting rifle felt familiar and solid in his hands as he sought clear shots at the remaining two men. But this wasn't like the jungles of Vietnam, where enemies were clearly identified and rules of engagement were understood by all parties. This was chaos, with Ghost and her target rolling through the snow in a tangle of fur and winter clothing, while two other armed men tried to position themselves for shots that wouldn't hit their own partner. Time slowed to the crystalline clarity that came with extreme danger, each moment stretching to contain infinite possibility. Jeremiah could see the lean man raising his weapon toward Ghost, could see Martha diving for better cover behind her truck, could see the third man swinging his gun toward the cabin windows, as if expecting additional threats to emerge from that direction. And in that moment of perfect clarity, Jeremiah Holt remembered what it felt like to be a soldier. The first shot came from the lean man's pistol, aimed at Ghost as she fought with the grey-haired leader in the blood-stained snow. But wolves had been surviving human hunters for millennia, and Ghost rolled away from her opponent at the crucial moment, using his body as a shield between herself and the gunman. The bullet meant for her took the grey-haired man in the shoulder, spinning him sideways with a curse that was part pain and part fury. Jeremiah's rifle spoke immediately afterward, the familiar kick of the old Remington against his shoulder as he put a round through the lean man's upper thigh. 30 years of hunting had taught him to aim for stopping shots rather than killing ones when possible, wound them badly enough to take them out of the fight, but leave them alive for questioning if necessary. The lean man went down hard, his pistol flying from his grip as he hit the snow-covered ground. But the third gunman was already moving, using the confusion of the melee to work his way toward better cover behind a pile of old lumber left over from some long-forgotten construction project. "Martha," Jeremiah called, without taking his eyes off the remaining threats. "You armed?"
"Shotgun in the truck."
She called back, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around her improvised command post. 12 gauge behind the seat." Ghost had released her grip on the grey-haired leader and was now circling him like the apex predator she'd always been, her yellow eyes calculating the most effective approach for a second attack. The man was trying to reach his dropped pistol with his uninjured arm, but every time he moved toward the weapon, Ghost would feint forward with a snarl that promised swift and decisive consequences. The wounded leader was learning what humans had forgotten over centuries of urban living, that wolves were not dogs, that they were creatures perfectly designed for bringing down prey much larger than themselves, and that they remembered every lesson their species had learned about survival in a world where hesitation meant death. "Call her off," the grey-haired man shouted, blood streaming from the bullet wound in his shoulder and from the deep scratches Ghost's claws had left across his face. "Call her off, and maybe we can still work something out." But Jeremiah was tracking the third gunman, who had reached his cover and was now trying to line up a shot at either Ghost or her human protector. The old military instincts were fully engaged now, his mind automatically calculating angles and distances, predicting movement patterns, and identifying tactical advantages. The emergency flare gun hung on a nail beside his cabin door, part of the survival equipment every sensible mountain dweller kept readily accessible. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it could serve as a signal, and right now, drawing attention from any legitimate authorities in the area seemed like a very good idea. "Ghost," Jeremiah called sharply. "Here, girl." She responded immediately, abandoning her stalking of the wounded leader to bound through the snow toward Jeremiah's position. Her movement was fluid and powerful despite the weeks of recovery, a reminder that beneath the gentle companion he'd been caring for was a creature built for exactly this kind of violent confrontation. As Ghost reached his side, Jeremiah fired another shot, this one aimed at the lumber pile where the third gunman had taken cover. The bullet splintered wood just inches from the man's position, forcing him to duck down and giving Martha time to retrieve the shotgun from her truck. "Federal agents are really coming," Martha called out as she worked the action on the shotgun with practiced competence. "I wasn't lying about that part. Called them this morning when I saw those tracks around your place." The gray-haired leader was trying to bind his wounded shoulder with strips torn from his shirt, his face pale with blood loss and pain. The lean man was still conscious, but clearly out of the fight, both hands pressed against the bleeding wound in his thigh. That left only the third gunman, who was proving to be the most dangerous of the group, calmer under fire, better trained, more professional in his approach to violence. "How long?" Jeremiah asked, keeping his rifle trained on the lumber pile. "Maybe 20 minutes, Martha replied. "Maybe less if they heard the gunfire." 20 minutes was a lifetime in a firefight, especially when facing an opponent who might have military or law enforcement training. But it was also long enough for mistakes to be made, for ammunition to run low, for the adrenaline that kept people functioning in combat to start wearing off. Ghost pressed against Jeremiah's leg, her breathing steady but alert. She was watching the lumber pile with the same intensity she'd once used to track prey through the wilderness, reading subtle signs of movement that human senses couldn't detect. Then she stiffened, her head turning toward the tree line behind the cabin, and Jeremiah realized their problems had just gotten significantly worse. The third gunman wasn't the only threat they were facing. More men were moving through the trees, approaching their position with the coordinated precision of a trained team. The operation was bigger than 3 opportunistic poachers. Much bigger. The new arrivals weren't more poachers. Through the scope of his rifle, Jeremiah could see the telltale signs of federal agents, coordinated movement, professional-grade equipment, and the disciplined advance of people who had trained for exactly these situations. Martha's call for backup had been real after all, and they were arriving just as the firefight reached its most dangerous point. "Federal agents," came a voice amplified by a bullhorn from somewhere in the tree line. "Everyone put down your weapons and step away from cover." The remaining gunman behind the lumber pile apparently decided that facing federal charges was preferable to facing Ghost and Jeremiah in a prolonged firefight. His pistol came sailing out from behind cover, followed by his hands raised high in surrender. "Coming out," he called. "Don't shoot." But the gray-haired leader, wounded and bleeding, had other ideas. Using the distraction of the federal arrival, he lunged for his dropped pistol with his good arm. Ghost saw the movement before Jeremiah did, her predator's instincts reading the subtle shift in body language that preceded violent action. She moved like liquid lightning, covering the distance between herself and the wounded man in 2 powerful bounds. But instead of attacking, she planted herself directly over the pistol, her body creating an impenetrable barrier between the weapon and the man who wanted to reach it. The gray-haired leader found himself face to face with 80 pounds of apex predator, staring into yellow eyes that held absolutely no fear and even less mercy. Ghost's lips pulled back to reveal teeth that had been designed for crushing bone, and the sound that rumbled from her throat was older than civilization, older than the treaty between humans and dogs, older than the illusion that mankind had conquered the wild places of the world. "Jesus," the wounded man whispered, finally understanding what he was facing. This wasn't a trained attack dog or a domesticated animal playing at wildness. This was something that remembered when humans were just another form of prey, something that had learned to survive in a world where hesitation meant death for yourself and your pack. Federal agents emerged from the tree line with weapons drawn but not aimed, their training evident in the careful way they approached a situation involving multiple armed parties and an unpredictable wild animal. The lead agent was a woman in her 40s, compact and professional, with the kind of calm competence that came from years of dealing with dangerous wildlife criminals. "I'm Agent Sarah Chen, Fish and Wildlife Service," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the blood-stained snow. "Sir, I need you to secure that wolf while we sort this situation out." "She's not going anywhere," Jeremiah replied, lowering his rifle but keeping it ready. "And she's not the problem here." Agent Chen approached carefully, her eyes taking in the scene with professional assessment. 2 wounded men, 1 surrendering, blood in the snow, and a wolf that was clearly protecting her human companions rather than threatening them. It wasn't the typical scenario they trained for. "This is the missing female from the Bitterroot pack," she said, studying Ghost with obvious recognition. "She's been off our tracking system for months. We thought she was dead." The grey-haired leader tried to speak, blood frothing on his lips from what might have been a punctured lung. "She's ours." "Got papers?" "Sir, you need to remain quiet," Agent Chen replied briskly, then turned to Jeremiah. "Can you tell me what happened here?" As federal medics worked to stabilize the wounded poachers and other agents secured the scene, Jeremiah found himself telling a story he'd never expected to share. The discovery of Ghost in the cage, her slow recovery, the revelation about the tracking collar and what it represented. Martha filled in details about the suspicious vehicles and the men's threats, while Ghost remained close to Jeremiah's side, her presence steady and reassuring. Agent Chen examined the tracking collar with obvious excitement, running a handheld scanner over its surface and nodding at whatever data she was receiving. "This device contains 18 months of movement data from the Bitterroot pack before they were killed. Territory maps, denning sites, hunting grounds, everything we need to establish permanent protection zones. And everything those men needed to help their clients avoid environmental regulations," Martha added grimly. The homemade splint that Jeremiah had fashioned for Ghost's injured paw weeks earlier was still visible beneath her thick winter coat, a reminder of how far she'd come from the dying animal he'd found in that cage. Agent Chen noticed it too, her professional demeanor softening slightly as she recognized the care that had gone into helping the wolf recover. "She chose you," the agent said quietly, watching Ghost press closer to Jeremiah as the activity around them intensified. "Wolves don't usually bond with humans like this, especially not wild ones. She had to decide to trust you, had to choose to let you help her heal." Jeremiah looked down at Ghost, remembering the frightened, dying animal he'd carried home in his arms, remembering the long nights when he'd wondered if she would survive until morning. Now she was standing alert and protective beside him, ready to face whatever came next. "I guess we chose each other," he said. And for the first time in 30 years, the words felt like truth rather than wishful thinking. 3 weeks after the gunfight that had shattered the winter quiet of the Bitterroot Mountains, Jeremiah stood on his porch in the early morning light, watching Ghost explore the perimeter of what had become a much busier piece of wilderness. Federal agents had been coming and going for days, setting up monitoring equipment and establishing the framework for what Agent Chen called the most significant wildlife conservation breakthrough in decades. The data from Ghost's tracking collar had revealed not just her pack's territory, but migration corridors that connected to other wolf populations across 3 states. Armed with that information, the Fish and Wildlife Service was moving. quickly to establish protected zones that would ensure the genetic diversity necessary for species recovery. But for all the official activity and scientific importance, what mattered most to Jeremiah was the quiet transformation he could see in Ghost herself. She moved with the confidence of an animal who had remembered what it meant to choose her own path, to trust her own instincts. The wounded, dying creature he'd found in that cage had become something powerful and self-possessed, a wolf who had learned that not all humans were enemies. Agent Chen approached from where she'd been consulting with the monitoring team, her expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal concern. Over the past weeks, she'd spent considerable time at the cabin, coordinating the investigation and overseeing Ghost's integration into the federal program. "The tracking data has given us everything we need," she said, settling onto the porch steps beside Jeremiah. "Territory maps, seasonal migration patterns, denning preferences. It's like having a GPS record of how wolves actually use this landscape." Jeremiah nodded, whittling shavings from a piece of pine that would eventually become a walking stick. The repetitive motion was soothing, a way to keep his hands busy while his mind processed the changes that had swept through his carefully ordered existence. "What happens to her now?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "That's complicated," Agent Chen admitted. "Normally we'd relocate her to join another pack, help her integrate back into wild wolf society. But her case is unique. She's bonded with you in a way that's extremely rare for wild wolves. Forcing separation could cause significant psychological trauma." Ghost looked up from her investigation of a scent trail near the woodshed, as if sensing she was the subject of their conversation. Her yellow eyes held the intelligence Jeremiah had come to recognize, not the simple awareness of a domestic animal, but the complex cognition of a creature who understood that her future was being discussed. "There's another option," Agent Chen continued carefully. "The service has been looking for experienced wildlife consultants to help with the expanded protection program. Someone who knows this territory, understands wolf behavior, and has demonstrated the kind of patience required for long-term observation work." Jeremiah's hands stilled on the walking stick. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a chance to be part of something important. The pack territories Ghost mapped out need constant monitoring. We need someone living on site who can track movement patterns, identify potential threats, and serve as liaison with local communities." She paused, watching his reaction. "The work would allow Ghost to remain with you while contributing to species recovery efforts. She'd be doing what she was born to do, helping her people survive." The phrase struck Jeremiah with unexpected force. Helping her people survive. It was what soldiers were supposed to do, what fathers were supposed to do, what any decent person was supposed to do when they had the chance to make a difference. All his adult life, he'd been running from that responsibility, convinced that his capacity for caring was too damaged to be trusted. But looking at Ghost, seeing the quiet strength she'd developed during her recovery, he understood that healing wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending that damage could be undone. It was about finding purpose that honored both the pain and the possibility, about using hard-earned wisdom to protect things that mattered. "What would it involve?" he asked. "Living here, essentially. Maintaining observation posts, collecting behavioral data, coordinating with research teams. It's not exciting work by most standards. Lots of patience, lots of waiting, lots of detailed record-keeping." Jeremiah smiled at that description. "Sounds like trapping, but in reverse." "Exactly like trapping in reverse," Agent Chen agreed. "Instead of hunting wolves, you'd be helping them flourish." Ghost approached the porch with the fluid grace that had returned to her movement as her strength rebuilt itself. She settled beside Jeremiah's chair with the proprietary confidence of a creature who had claimed this space as her own. When he reached down to stroke her head, she leaned into his touch with complete trust. "She's not really tame, you know," Agent Chen observed. "She's choosing to be here, choosing to trust you. That's different." "I know," Jeremiah replied, feeling the warmth of Ghost's fur beneath his weathered fingers. She could leave any time she wanted. Sometimes she disappears for hours, checking the territory, following scent trails. But she always comes back, because this is home now. The word carried weight it hadn't possessed since Sarah's death, since Michael's departure, since he'd convinced himself that solitude was safer than connection. But sitting on his porch, with Ghost pressed against his legs, and federal agents working to protect the wilderness he'd called home for 30 years, Jeremiah understood that some kinds of safety were just elaborate forms of death. The walking stick in his hands was nearly finished, smooth and straight and strong enough to support a man's weight on uncertain ground. Like the bond he'd formed with Ghost, it was something useful born from patient work and careful attention. Proof that even damaged people could create things of value if they were willing to try. "When do I start?" he asked. Agent Chen smiled, the expression transforming her professional demeanor into something more human and hopeful. "You already have, Mr. Holt. You started the day you decided to care about something other than your own pain." As the sun climbed higher over the Bitterroot Mountains, Jeremiah felt something he'd almost forgotten existed: anticipation for tomorrow, curiosity about what the future might bring. Ghost stirred beside him, lifting her head to scan the tree line with the alertness of a creature who understood that vigilance was the price of freedom. They had found each other in cages of their own making, his built from guilt and isolation, hers from human cruelty and abandonment. But together, they had discovered that sometimes the hardest prison to escape was the one you built around your own heart, and that sometimes it took saving another soul to remember there was still good left in your own. The mountains stretched away in all directions, vast and wild and full of possibilities neither of them had dared to imagine just a few weeks before.